Presto changeo. I watched as the magician made a bunch of flowers pop from his previously empty hat in awe. I glanced at my mother to see her reaction as well, and she wore a tight-lipped smile. She looked down at me as if sensing my eyes on her, and tried for a bigger, more genuine smile while patting my hand. It was a special night. I was up late eating pizza, drinking soda, and watching a magician with my mom. I was unsure what the occasion was, but it didn't really matter to me. I noticed my mum seemed upset. Obviously something was bothering her, but I knew better than to ask. The problem with being small is that there were never any answers to my questions. We left with my mother carrying me out. I rested my head on her shoulder and tried to keep myself awake. I could feel her heartbeat against my chest, her breath on my shoulder, coming in laborious gasps. I was already too old to be carried, really, but since it was so late, and I was sluggish with my exhaustion, my mother had scooped me up and kissed my forehead before carrying me to the parking lot. People swarmed around us, some bumping into my mother, which in turn jostled me. It was about that time I noticed a person behind us, smiling at me. I lifted my fingers and gave a half wave before shyly burrowing my face into my mother's blonde hair. My mother was put off by my movement and had to hitch me up higher to catch her balance. We made it to the car, and I climbed into my seat and pulled the clip on my chest closed, while my mum buckled the bottom. She gave a tug to the car seat strap to make sure it was tight, and then shut me in the back seat alone. I'd expected her to turn and get in the front seat immediately, but instead I saw her leaning against the car. Her body seemed to shiver, and she reached into her purse and pulled out a box. Cigarettes. Not to touch, not to ask about for sure. Because there was little, or because it was a forbidden topic in general, I wasn't sure. But I was generally redirected to another area if I spoke, as if she realized I could see what she was doing, and it had just occurred to her that I probably shouldn't be watching her. So I waited sleepily, making an effort to stay awake. It was so late, much later than my usual bedtime. The world around was darker than I'd ever remembered seeing it. I yawned and felt myself falling into a sleep before my mum even got back into the car. I awoke to my mum driving. I could hear the road sounds, and my mum was crying quietly, the sound of her sniffling and the catch of her breath giving her away. I was too tired to ask where we were, although I wondered. The scenery looked unfamiliar. I started to drift off again, lulled by the hum of the wheels on the road. But then a bang, and the car jolted gracelessly, pulling and shaking. My mum pulled over, and the car shuddered and then shut off altogether. I stayed quiet and watched the back of my mother. She didn't move. She'd move her hand to the steering wheel and then drop it halfway. I wondered what she was doing. She glanced back at me. Her expression was worried, and her cheeks were covered in tears. "Are you all right, love?" she asked, reaching for me. I nodded. "Mummy must have hit something on the road. The tire's flat. We're going to have to walk. See if we can find help, okay?" "Call Daddy?" I asked. I wondered where my daddy was. My mum's face fell, and then she recovered. She pulled her face into an apologetic smile. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at me like that for a while before turning around and getting the keys out of the ignition. She came around and unbuckled me and helped me out. We stood behind the car on a back country road. My mother shifted her feet and bit her lip, looking forward and behind us. Indecisive, unsure of the best way to go. I assumed that meant that anyone worth walking to was very far behind us. I lifted my arms to her, wanting to be picked up, but she gently pushed one arm down and grabbed my hand. "Forward," she exclaimed. I jumped at the sudden sound of her voice after the silence. The cheeriness in her voice made me think that maybe it wasn't so bad. She gave me a light tug, and we headed forward, leaving the car behind. I was still tired, but I tried to keep pace with her as much as I could. A few times my feet seemed to just stop moving, and she would continue on, unaware, until she was yanking me behind her, nearly tripping herself up. A heavy sigh would follow, and she would slow her own pace. After a while she stopped and gestured for me to sit. I looked at the ground she was gesturing towards, and sat down uneasily, hoping that the grass wouldn't brush my legs, making them itchy and scratchy. She herself did not sit down, but instead pulled out a cigarette and lit it. She also pulled out her phone and stared at it. It wasn't on because it didn't light up like it usually does, but she continued to stare all the same. Once her cigarette was gone, she tossed it in the road and stomped it out. She dropped her hand down, fingers splayed as an indication that I was to rise and hold her hand so we could walk again. I was so tired, and I felt the tears building up. "No," I cried, sitting back down. She looked helpless standing there, staring down at me, unsure of how to proceed. "You're very sleepy and very tired, I know that. You've been very brave walking along the road with me in the dark. I just need you to be brave a little longer, okay?" She was kneeling in front of me, stroking my face and pushing my hair back behind my ear, even though in such short length the curl would spring it right back to where it was. She was smiling at me. "Come on, it can be a game, okay? You see if you can walk 100 steps without losing count." "I want to go home. No walking, no counting," I whined, even though the idea of counting my steps did sound like fun. I crossed my arm over my chest defiantly. "I'll give you ice cream when we get home, okay?" She was pleading now, pulling at me to stand and follow her. I was suspicious. Ice cream sounded good, but only if she actually remembered to give me some. "When will we be home?" "I don't know, but it's going to take a hell of a lot longer if we're sitting here instead of moving forward," she said pointedly. I yawned and stood. I started walking with her, trying to convince my short, tired legs to continue moving. The walking seemed to go on forever, so at first I didn't notice how it had grown completely silent. I was, instead, focused on what kind of ice cream I wanted and how much I thought I could get. I noticed her hand squeeze mine tight for a second, and her steps had slowed. I looked at her face, wondering what was going on. She was glancing around nervously, her head cocked as if trying to locate a sound. "Mommy?" I asked, staring at her. She put a finger over her lips and shushed me and continued to listen. That was when I noticed the silence. I wondered what she could be trying to hear. She grasped my hand tighter and yanked my arm to hurry me a little, like when we were crossing a street downtown. I tried to move myself faster, but I was hurting so much that it was very difficult. We continued to move quickly before hearing a crunchy noise. My mum jumped and grabbed me in one swift motion up in her arms. The relief my feet felt was overshadowed by the new pain in my arm from being grabbed up so violently. She hugged me to her, crushing me as she spun slowly around trying to find the source. I could feel her heart jackhammering against my stomach. She couldn't find the sound, but after a while she continued our path with me crushed into her. I was afraid to wiggle myself around for room in case she remembered she was carrying me when I was such a big boy who could walk by himself and much too big to be carried. Her steps were much faster now that she didn't have to stay slow for me, and we were making much better progress than before. I began to hear a shuffling noise off in the distance. Judging by the way we moved faster and the frantic breathing from my mum, I had a feeling she could hear it too. There were no bird sounds and no other animal sounds, no wind or other cars driving by. Just the slow stop and go shuffling sound over dead leaves. Occasionally a twig would snap, sounding nearer to us every time, causing my mum to whimper and tighten her constrictor-like hold on me. It wasn't a hurried sound like my mother's steps were, but rather a slow, casual sound, managing to stay close to us anyway. Then there was a crash, something falling into the leaves and then rustling. My mum put her hand against the back of my head, and I buried my face in her neck. She began to run, faster than I knew she could. I was bouncing against her, my chin hitting her shoulder repeatedly, so I kept my tongue in check in case I accidentally bit it. There was a roaring in my ears, and I could barely hear the sounds outside of my head. I heard enough to know it sounded like several people, or animals, behind us. I peeked my eyes out to glance back to see. I saw nothing at first. I had to concentrate from my mother running and subsequently my vision being bounced about. But there, in the woods, a white flash would slip between the trees, seemingly liquid. It would come close to the edge of the clearing, but never came all the way out. Never came close enough for me to make out any other features besides being a white blur following next to us. My mum was getting tired, and she was having trouble running anymore, the adrenaline waning and exhaustion setting in. So it was a huge relief to see lights on the left side of us, a path that led to an enormous house. My mum ran again, faster. Her breath came out gasping and uneven. We got to the door, and she threw her free arm, not holding me, up against it. Banging again and again, she began to scream for them to let us in. A bewildered old woman opened the door. Mum ran in and slammed the door shut, grasping for the locks. She practically threw me down as she herself collapsed on the floor. "Are you all right?" the old woman asked, shaking. "Is there something I can get you? Do you need a phone?" "Someone behind us." My mum had her hands on her stomach, trying desperately to control her breathing. I could hear the rhythm returning. "Our car broke down a few miles back. We walked, then a noise. Someone behind us, and we ran. We ran until we got here." It was at that moment something else slammed against the door. I started to cry, so tired and scared I just wanted to go home. It kept slamming, hard enough to shake the house. The elderly woman looked conflicted. "Was there someone else with you?" she asked, hesitating, wondering if she should open the door again. More than likely regretting having opened the door for us. My mother shook her head violently as the banging increased. She reached for me and ran her fingers through my hair, although she made no attempt to really console me. The banging increased in volume. The elderly woman held up her phone and started calling the police, ushering us to a bedroom. As we entered the room, the door came open. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. My mother grabbed me close to her, and the other woman pushed us all into a closet. My face was smashed against my mother's chest, and it felt like I couldn't breathe in the small space. My mother shushed me when I whimpered. I heard footsteps, coming closer now. Then, without warning, the door flew open. I looked up and saw the magician. "Presto, changeo," he said. And then he and I were gone.
Hey there. Thank you so much for taking the time to drop by and listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me. I put a lot of time and effort into making these videos, so it's nice to know that there's someone out there listening. Do me a little favor, would you? Click that like button, leave a comment, and if you really feel like it, why not subscribe too? Okay, happy tales everyone. See you soon.